Hey guys, it's Mazda Monday, and yeah, it's just right at midnight. Barely made the cutoff for Mazda Monday. So as I told you guys last week, this week we're going to be talking about spark plugs. Okay, so as you guys all know, I highly recommend to all my customers to use the Nissan GTR NGK spark plugs, right? And that's for a number of reasons. The main one being ion sensing, which we'll get into in a minute. But before we address how the spark plugs can actually affect performance, I want to just show you guys something that a lot of people in the past have brought up to me about spark plugs, and I kind of disregarded it. And now, since I've had this incident happen, I'm no longer using eBay for anything, right? eBay was my best friend for the longest time until I recently ran into fake spark plugs. I've been using eBay to buy pumps, but obviously I'm not going to do that anymore just because the last few pumps I got, they were all broken. So out of the last 15 pumps, 9 of them were broken. So I'm done with eBay pretty much completely. The spark plugs that I were buying off eBay, the GTR ones, I'm now buying through the actual website. It's cheaper, so I'm going to leave links for that. But to start off, guys, I just want to show you guys how to spot a fake spark plug, and then we'll go into the reason why the GTR plugs are superior to your stock plugs. All right, so let's go and take a look at these spark plugs. This is the stock plug. As you can see, it does not have a second iridium tip at the top on this. Versus on the GTR, you'll see there is a center probe, and then there's also another iridium tip on the end. And this right here is our Honda plug, which I bought off of eBay, and it is a fake plug, right? And the reason how I identified it was a fake plug, because I mean, they look identical, right? You're looking at these. There's a little bit difference up here at the top as far as the how to screw it in, the threads. But in the on the online pictures, it looks like that as well, which isn't an issue. But what is an issue is that up here on the top prone, because it's supposed to be dual iridium, right? If I can get a good picture, you'll notice that it's not a cylinder shape. It almost looks like they soldered a piece at the top, right? And if you look at the GTR plug, it's hard to get a focus on this. I'm gonna show you guys in the picture once I take one. I don't know what's wrong with this camera. It's hard for it to focus in. But if you look in the picture that I'm gonna show you in a second, the GTR plug looks legit like it was laser cut, right? That Honda plug at the top, at the iridium tip, it does not look like it was laser cut. It looked like somebody took some solder and put it on there. And that's how I can identify that this is a fake dual iridium plug versus a real dual iridium plug. So guys, stay away from the eBay plugs. I buy these GTR plugs from 60 Auto. They do have an eBay account, but it's more expensive on eBay. If you go directly to the site, it's gonna be legit, right? Okay, guys, so now that we kind of touched on, stock plug versus GTR plug versus the fake Honda plugs, we'll discuss more, because there's also different types of plugs like the Rutheniums, which a lot of people have been using the Ruthenium NGK plugs because they're cheaper. And, with the marketing from NGK, people assume that the Ruthenium plugs are better, which they are not better, because I've tested them. A couple of my supercharged customers tested them. They did not perform as well as the GTR spark plugs, and that's for a number of reasons. But a lot of people think that the Rutheniums are better because based on the science and all the little tables that NGK created for you to buy them. But it's just marketing. The real reason why, they're marketing so hard with the Ruthenium is because it's way cheaper to manufacture Rutheniums. And then they can also sell it to the customer at a lower price, which allows them, it's just better sales. If it's cheaper for you to make it, you can give it to the customer for cheaper, and the plugs work decent. But for high performance application, those plugs are not the best. A lot of people don't know, and there's a reason why the dual iridium plugs cost more. The material is more expensive and it's just higher quality overall. And the one main thing I noticed about the ruthenium plugs versus the dual iridium plug is that the ruthenium spark plugs, they're brittle, right? So if you're someone who wants to resize your spark plug gap so that you can, go smaller gap for high boost applications, iridium plugs, if you go to bend the tips, a lot of times they end up cracking, and the next thing you know, you're having random misfires down the road, like me and a few other people did, because the iridium, or not the iridium, but the rutheniums do not like to be regapped, because the ruthenium material, it does not like to be bent. Is brittle in comparison. It more breaks off than bends compared to iridium. So ruthenium plugs, guys, they're cheaper for a reason. Avoid the plug. We've had one guy blow up using iridium plugs, and he was mad at me. I personally almost blew up using ruthenium plugs. I almost blew up using ruthenium plugs because they could not handle the heat of the fuel injection cleaner, and I was having very bad misfires. And then when I checked the plug, they were cracked. All right. And then another guy went on a dyno with the ruthenium plugs versus the GTR plugs at the same gap, had a lot of breakup with the ruthenium. So out of the, 5 to 8 customers I had with ruthenium plugs, they all had less than optimal results compared to the dual iridium, laser iridium plugs. So avoid trying to go with the cheap stuff. I know it's cheaper. Cheaper doesn't mean better. Go with quality. The NGK dual iridium laser is the best one out of the NGK brand, and that's why they cost more. So anyways, besides the different, selection of types like copper versus iridium versus ruthenium, the reason why there's those different heat ranges or different compounds is for different heat ranges and stuff like that. So let's go over, because everybody knows, like, most of the older plugs used to be copper plugs. Copper plugs are great conductors, but they heat up very fast. So iridium is not as good of a conductor as copper, but it does not heat up as fast. It dissipates heat a lot better. And then ruthenium, same thing, is supposed to dissipate heat a lot better, but it's cheaper. So I don't believe in the ruthenium at all. The research is kind of BS to me. So anyways, here we go. The different materials are used for different heat ranges, and also the depth of the plug is going to determine how much heat it can dissipate into the head. So as you get colder in spark plugs, you'll notice that the insulating material is going to be higher up the spark plug, so it can pull the heat from the spark plug into the head and dissipate it into the head of the motor and get rid of some of that heat. So anyways, what is the importance of a heat range, right? So for NGK, the lower the number, the hotter the plug is, meaning it can get to operating temperature really quick, which is a lot of naturally aspirated motors use. But the issue with that in boosted application is obviously it getting too hot and then having pre-ignition or a misfire, because once you get to a certain heat level, resistance builds up. So you want hot plugs because it keeps carbon deposits from being on the spark plugs, right? So you want them to be hot enough to where the carbon deposits don't build up on a spark plug, but you don't want it hotter than it needs to be. So as you're going up in heat range, like, you know, a 7 or 8 on the heat range, those plugs tend to dissipate heat better. But obviously, if you keep going up in the range, like to a heat range 9, it dissipates so much heat that the plugs do not stay hot enough to keep carbon deposits from burning or from sticking to it. So when you're choosing a spark plug, you don't want to go too high of a heat range because the spark plug's foul. They'll get carbon deposits on it. And you don't want to go too hot of a heat range because then you're going to end up with misfires. So the stock plugs on the turbo and the NA model are both heat range 7 for NGK plugs, right? That's a pretty reasonable right in the middle number. But the difference between the turbo model and the NA model, even though the NA model use the same heat range plugs, they both use a 7, is that the turbo model has a smaller spark plug gap than the NA model. And the reason for that was, like I was mentioned earlier, as atmospheric pressure increases, or if you have boost pressure, now the amount of power and voltage needed to jump the gap between the spark plugs, it needs to increase, right? Because as there's pressure in there, it's going to be harder for that spark to jump that gap. So what you do is you make the gap smaller, and it creates less resistance for that spark to jump. So when you use boosted cars, the gap's typically going to be smaller. I believe for the turbo model is about a 0.03 for the gap, and like NA, like I said, is 0.044. And on the GTR plugs, they come stock at 0.032. Now, when I tell guys with a naturally aspirated car to leave the gap at the 0.032, that is for a very specific reason. I know the stock gap is 0.044, but because I lean out your air-fuel ratio, you're gonna want a smaller gap. And the reason why you're gonna want a smaller gap is because, one, there's this thing called ion sensing, right? And it registers, you know, your electrons and stuff like that. And when you have a bigger gap, it's gonna have less of those ions around the electrode. I'll show you in a picture real quick. But as a lean out your mixture, in order to register the right amount of ions, you're gonna want a smaller gap. All right. And also, because I am increasing you guys' power, increasing the heat, and also increasing your RPM, having that smaller gap is just going to be more safe to make sure you don't end up with a misfire. All right, guys. So the main thing of having a good spark plug is to prevent misfires and to also provide proper feedback through your ignition coils to the ECU. All right, so in your car, when, you know, especially if you're like data logging or anything like that, you get a misfire code like a Papa 0300 or a Papa 0301 or whatever. So you get a random misfire. The way the car knows there's a misfire is by the registered difference in amperage or resistance. So if your spark, so I guess it's called, yeah, it's a misfire, or there's another term I'm looking for when you don't have a spark. You have spark blowout. All right, so spark blowout means that spark plug, the actual firing of the spark plug could not jump the gap. So that is a spark blowout when the plug is in there and there might be so much high boost pressure that the spark couldn't jump. That's called a spark blowout. All right, misfires are kind of almost in the same category as spark blowout. It's slightly different because you can have a misfire at any time in the cylinder. That doesn't necessarily mean it's a spark blowout. A spark blowout happens when the spark plug is supposed to fire. Sorry, tongue twister. Spark blowout is when the spark plug is supposed to fire and it doesn't fire. All right. That happens usually, like I said, when the gap is too big. Now, a misfire can happen when there's an ignition at the wrong time. It doesn't have to be because the spark did not fire. It could just happen because there was too much heat and you get pre-ignition. So the detonation just happened at the wrong time. That is a misfire. So say like, the stroke was going and you get your normal firing order and all of a sudden the cylinder just was too hot. And as you're coming up, before the spark plug even engaged, it detonated the mixture that was in the cylinder. So that's a misfire when it happens randomly like that. And it could be due to heat. It could be due to multiple different things. But a lot of times you might have a cylinder wall that's causing a spark and it causes it to go out, like a heat spot. They have hot spots in the cylinder wall and that can cause it to go off. Or your octane's too low, and when you're compressing all the air and the fuel in the mixture, because the octane is too low, it detonates before it reaches the spark. Now, octane is a measure of resistance to detonation. When you have lower octane, as your cylinder is coming to compress the air and fuel, it can only go up so much before it detonates. With higher octane, it allows you to get closer to the spark, right? So if you're running 87 versus 91, with 91 octane, you can let that compression go all the way a little bit higher so you can get as much power out of the stroke as possible, versus when you're with 87, you have to be more careful with the stroke when you ignite it. Like, you can't advance the timing too much with 87 because there's only a certain amount of time that is allowed for you to do the stroke before you detonate. 91 allows a little bit more time. 93 allows a little bit more time before you detonate. And then also, let's be on the subject. We'll talk about octane in another topic. But anyways, let's get back to the spark plugs. The coils give feedback to the ECU, and so the coils are connected to the spark plugs. If the spark plugs do not give off the right amount of amperage feedback to the coils, then the ECU is going to really think something's wrong. All right. So as I'm subjecting these cars to hotter temperatures through tuning and whatnot, you want to be able to allow the car to feel okay to still advance ignition timing. Now, if I leave the gap at that 0.044 and the temperatures are increasing in the cylinder and whatnot, the registered amperage and voltage from each firing of the spark plug is going to be is not going to be as great. So the feedback signal is going to be less with that bigger gap versus a smaller gap. So I kind of use the GTR plugs to compensate for the leaning out of the fuel, because I want the registered voltage / amperage feedback to the coil to be similar to what it was when it was 0.44. But if I have that 0.44 gap with my leaner air fuel ratio, sometimes the feedback to the coils will say, hey, there's a misfire or a spark blowout going on, so reduce ignition timing. So if what the coils are registering is not enough, it'll give feedback to the ECU to lower ignition timing. So I'm using the spark plugs to trick the ECU not to lower ignition timing. But obviously there's still a margin of safety, because of how I'm tuning in there, and I'm still leaving safety guards up to prevent like actual detonation, and the car's still registering knock through the knock sensor. So yeah, hopefully I didn't lose anyone in me talking about this. It's kind of hard to talk about it in a short 30-minute video, but pretty much if you're gonna upgrade your spark plug, guys, just use the GTR spark plugs and get them from 60 Auto. I had tried some Honda plugs and they came back to be fake. Like I told you, they were $45, so it was worth the shot. But like people were telling me online, there's a lot of fakes, and like I had to find out for myself. But luckily, the 160 Auto that we've been using is on the authorized list for dealers of NGK. So you can trust that 60 Auto is going to give you the best price. I was actually paying $70 on eBay. Now, because I've been, referred by one of the guys on Instagram, I went to the actual 60 Auto website and I applied for my discount. I can get these spark plugs for under $60. Whereas if you go into a dealership or any online store, one spark plug will usually cost you 45 to 50 bucks versus you can get 4 for that price, right? So guys, the GTR plugs work on all Skyactiv-G from 2012 all the way through 2024. All of them can use the same exact plug. You do not adjust the gap, especially if you're getting tuned. I know like the whole purpose in having a bigger gap on NA is to allow a leaner burn. So when you have a bigger gap, there's a better chance that you're going to catch some of that lean mixture to have a complete burn. But here's the thing, once that coil sparks, or once the spark plug sparks, it's going to ignite that mixture. It's just like, but here's the thing, I noticed a bigger gap will give you better air mixture. A smaller gap will ensure that it burns at high RPM. So, because the spark is guaranteed to hit every time, especially when you're boosted. You want that smaller gap too, so that you don't get like I said, a spark blowout or anything like that. But a bigger gap, typically what I've seen when I've tested different gaps, bigger gaps helps you burn fuel more efficiency, because as that, that 14:7 air fuel ratio is misting through in this big gap, there's a big chance you're going to get a better flame front as the cylinder is doing combustion stroke. With that smaller gap, it has to start in a little certain point and then expand, versus when you have this bigger gap, there's a bigger burn pattern happening. So small gap versus big gap, the big gap is going to burn more efficiently, but there's also a risk of detonation and spark blowout if you go too big of a gap. So you always want to run as big as possible without getting any kind of misfires or spark blowout. But as far as I'm concerned, for all these Skyactiv applications that are aftermarket, whatever those NGK spark plugs from the GTR are set at, which is 0.032, leave it at that. There's been no performance. I mean, like actually with tuning, you won't even notice a difference in MPGs, because I'll increase it, because I'll lean out your mixture and it'll make up for any MPGs you might have lost. So here's the big takeaway, guys. I know I've been talking way too long. Ruthenium plugs, trash. Dual iridiums, those are the best. And the difference between a standard plug and a dual iridium is that the spark is going to be always concentrated iridium point to iridium point. And it kind of makes the focus of the spark stay in that one line versus veering off all over the top plug, the top electrode. All right. So it just makes the jumping very consistent for the flame front, having a dual iridium. So yeah, hopefully I didn't lose any of you guys. It's hard for me to like kind of don't want to say dumb it down, but just use general terms, because I know people from other countries are watching these videos, and I'm not trying to get too technical with certain terms. So it's hard for me, and I speak slow just so I don't use words that are just unnecessary. So that's it, guys. I'll leave a link in below for the GTR spark plugs. Those are the best spark plugs for the Skyactiv platform, hands down. I've tried 4 different types of plugs. And with that Honda plug that I was going to try, it's too hard not to find a fake. And I couldn't even find it on a 60 Auto website, which means I'm just not even going to waste my time. That is my #1 modification for all Skyactivs, is to do a GTR spark plugs, especially if you're going to get tuned and you're going to lean out your air fuel ratio. And the reason why I lean out the air fuel ratio is because these cars burn very rich when you're going wide open throttle, and that's to keep things cool. So I lean that mixture out, which means the combustion is hotter, and because it is hotter, I use a heat range 8 plug, which is the GTR plugs, versus the heat range 7 plug, which is a stock plug. So one heat range higher is still going to be hot enough to where you won't get carbon deposits. You go any higher than that heat range 8, and then you're going to run into issues with the spark plugs becoming fouled, and then the spark won't jump because it'll be caked with carbon. So don't go higher than 8. Honestly, just don't get any other plug besides the GTR plugs. They're the best plugs for these cars, especially when you're modified, guys. I don't know what else to say. They've been tried and true. I have 300 plus customers with the GTR plugs. People that aren't even my customers use it. So the only thing I would suggest, though, the reason why I was looking at the Honda plugs is because I don't want people to have to re-gap the spark plugs. And on the turbo models, the gap is actually technically tinier than 0.03. It actually is about 0.03, and the GTR is 0.032. So the turbo guys, I want them to go a little bit smaller gap. So if you're the turbo model, you're the only people I suggest, if you're gonna go high boost, to change your spark plug gap, right? So I suggest between 0.026 and 0.028 for the GTR spark plugs, if you're gonna re-gap it. If you're a turbo model, and the supercharged models can do this as well. But most people have not had issues in the supercharged models because we're not running nearly as much boost as the turbocharged models. So literally, it's just for the turbocharged models to reduce your spark plug gap to 0.026 to 0.028 inch, I'll leave that information in the description, guys. So now that I've been doing these videos, and last week I did the rear motor mount video, I had a lot of my customers reach out to me to give me their experiences with rear motor mounts. I had a customer of mine that bought the 3rd gen rear motor mount, and the polyurethane bushing cracked open that's inside the motor mount. So Corksport, being the good company they are, they sent him a warranty replacement, which kudos to them for sticking by their products and in a replacement. They sent him the replacement, it cracked again. And this, made me think, maybe this is why they changed bushing and made it smaller, because if you have a bigger material, the polyurethane is going to flex more, which is going to lead to cracking, versus when you have less material, the chances of cracking is going to be significantly lower. So as far as that goes now, guys, if you're going to get the rear motor mount for 4th gen, I would just get the inserts, and for you 3rd gen guys, because of what I've heard, I think the best solution is to stick to OEM and use the window adhesive in the mount. So for 3rd gen, honestly, my best advice would just be to stick to the stock OEM mount and fill it with window adhesive. Or you could try that the hard race mount and fill it with window adhesive. And for 4th gen, inserts or use the window adhesive. But if you guys really don't mind the vibrations, get the 4th gen rear motor mount. Just deal with the vibrations, But yeah, I just wanted to kind of cover that and show you these pictures. I just want to be as honest as possible. Corksport's a great company. It's just unfortunate that, these mounts are failing, and there's only so much you can do about it. All right, that's it for today, guys. Thank you.